Good morning,
everyone.
Good morning.
Hello.
I'm probably going to give about 5 minutes for everyone to get admitted, just to make sure I don't miss anyone. So we'll get started at 11:05. And I did want to let everyone know that we are recording today's session and it will be made available through Fanshawe Learns as a playlist after the fact. And I will send out the slide deck, so don't worry if you see any links or resources that you want to reference later, you'll be able to get them later. All right, I actually think that everyone that was registered has almost joined. So we'll get started. Looks like a few people are in the waiting room still. All right, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll try to keep an eye on the wait room in case we have any last minute joiners. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for taking the time to attend today's featured Open Education Week session on copyright compliance. My name is Christina Fry, and if we haven't had the pleasure yet to meet virtually, I'm your Copyright Services Officer here at the college. So let's just get things started. We have a jam-packed session. So on the agenda for today, we have a lot happening, so please do feel free to drop any questions you might have throughout the presentation in the chat box. I'll do my best to answer these throughout, but if we don't get to it, there will be time at the end for more general questions and discussion. So first, we're going to cover the basics of copyright law in Canada. Then we'll take a look at what copyright means for open education. It is Open Education Week after all, and that's why we're all here today. We'll then take some time to discuss the fair dealing exception in the Copyright Act. We'll also take a look at what zero textbook courses are and how you can make use of content legally in your course readings as well as your lecture slides. We'll wrap up by showcasing various supports available to you at the college to ensure that your course is indeed copyright compliant. Okay, so starting things off, bear with me. This is the longest slide, but we'll get through it. What is copyright? So in the simplest terms, it means the right to copy, but who holds these rights and where exactly do they come from is the question. So in Canada, copyright is housed under the umbrella of intellectual property law, And by definition, it's a legal mechanism that protects the moral and economic rights of a copyright owner. Copyright protection generally lasts for 50 years after the death of the content creator. When this period of time then lapses, the work would enter into the public domain and is then free to use in an unrestricted manner. However, this will change with the implementation of CUSMA or new NAFTA or USCMA, whatever the states is calling it, which will actually see us align with the US and Mexico to adopt the 70+ rule. CUSMA has been ratified, but amendments to the Copyright Act have not yet happened. There's a lot of conversations happening right now about how this will impact Canada, and the states is actually, well, copyright people in the states thought we could do better and stick with the 50, but here we are. So until these changes have been made, we will be operating under the Life Plus 50 rule until the Copyright Act has been updated. So as I mentioned, the Copyright Act protects both moral rights as well as economic rights, and both of these rights are bundled together to show an exhaustive list of ownership for the copyright owner. It is at their discretion on how they exercise these rights. So anyone else would need to seek permission from the copyright owner in order to exploit any of these rights. So first, let's take a look at the moral rights here on the left-hand side. Content creators do have the right to protect the reputations and integrity of their work, which is what the moral right is. But what's really interesting about the distinction and existence of moral rights within copyright in Canada is that moral rights are actually uniquely Canadian. These rights do not exist for our southern neighbors in the States, and our Copyright Act, like many Canadian laws, has both British and French influences. The moral rights here do come from the French side. So unlike economic rights, moral rights cannot be transferred or waived. They are always held by the content creator. So you can't buy moral rights or seek permission to use moral rights. The most significant moral right that you'll encounter day to day is the attribution right. And this is where copyright would align and overlap with plagiarism frequently. So let's go through each of these quickly to get a better understanding. The first one here is integrity. So the use of a work must not jeopardize its integrity, distort the work, or have any impact on the author's reputation. And then we have association. So the right to have credit or not have credit for a work. As the rights holder, you can actually refuse association. So for example, many artists in the States in the past few years have been struggling with this and not wanting their songs to be associated with certain political campaigns. Unfortunately, since creators don't have moral rights in the States, there's not much musicians could do if the work is being properly sampled or licensed. However, in Canada, creators would be able to stop other groups from using their work if they do not want to be associated with the organization or that organization's message. So that's just a really interesting right that we have here in Canada. And then we have attribution, the final moral right. This is a big one. Citing, referencing, this is essentially giving credit to the copyright owner. This cannot be waived. So anytime permission is sought for the work's economic rights, you would still always need to give the attribution right to the original creator. So let's now move on to all these economic rights, which we do encounter more frequently when we're seeking permissions to use content. So economic rights just generally are rights that the owner has to exploit the economic potential of their own work. There's, again, a number of different ones that we'll run through them quickly. So the first one here is reproduction. So this is usually the first right that would come to mind when people think about copyright. Reproduction is copying, so literally any replication by any means. And we're not just talking about photocopying. This could be scanning, downloading, uploading, etc. All of these are a form of reproduction. Then we have conversion and transfer. So changing the format of the work. An old-fashioned way to think about this would be the conversion from artwork from canvas to poster board. So, that oil painting, now you have print because it's way cheaper to buy the print. That is a conversion or transfer. Now, more commonly, we would be referring to this, right? Thinking about converting files from digital to print and vice versa. Then we have distribution, rental, and sales. So the circulating the work or copies of the work, whether for profit or not. So distributing handouts in a class or making work available online is a good example here. Then we have exhibition. So displaying a work in public, as soon as something is posted online for people to view, it is being displayed, so it is being exhibited. And then public performance, kind of similar here, but not. Performing a work in public. So if you're playing a movie, a clip from a movie, or oral recitation of a poem is being performed to any audience that's one or two people outside of your private household, this is all considered public performance. So say you grab your book, you want to go on the street corner and read it to all your neighbors, that is a public performance and would technically require permission to do so. If you did it in your backyard, maybe less so. Then we have first publication. So this would be a very important right to think about as faculty, because when you create work, you have the right to determine if that work, how it's made first available to anyone. So as the creator, you can determine the format, the medium, and the vehicle for which your work is first made public and how it's distributed. Another way to look at this would be student work. Say you have a really excellent assignment that was handed in by a student, and you really want to use this going forward as, you know, the shining example of what you're expecting for future assignments. You do need to ask that former student permission, because by showing it to the other students, that is a public offering. So this is different than when they would just submit the work to you for marking. So that permission would need to be granted. Then we have communication. So this is transmitting the work to the public by means of wired or wireless broadcast or telecommunication. This isn't really talking about the copyrighted work. It's talking actually about that broadcast signal. An example of this would be circumventing IP addresses to get American Netflix or Hulu or all the other streaming services that we don't have in Canada. That's breaking that communication right. Then we have adaptation and translation. So this is an adaptation of a work, you know, from a book to a movie, but embedded within that is also translation. So when books are being converted and republished in a bunch of different languages, that is a translation right, and that is something that as a copyright owner, you would get to decide how each of these rights are used or not used. And the final one here is authorization. So this is authorizing any of the above mentioned acts. That is the sole right of the copyright owner. Only the copyright owner can grant permission for any of these economic rights. And again, moral rights cannot be transferred unless you die and pass it on to your estate, but that's a different story. Not super important today. So now that we've covered all of these different types of rights that the content creator holds, it's important to note that as users, these are the rights that we have to respect. But as faculty, you are content creators, and these are your rights to enforce. There are no copyright police. So just keep in mind that these are your rights from both perspectives. So from a user's perspective, another thing to consider is that copyrighted works can have multiple copyright holders for different aspects of the work. So when thinking about the content you want to use, it's helpful to keep this in mind. So if we're thinking about a piece of music, there are multiple layers of rights associated with that. The same thing goes for imagery, and of course with video, because video content is made up of both audio and visual work, which could all totally have different creators. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're wanting to seek permissions for that type of content, that there is a number of layers and it can take quite a bit of time to get permission. So now that we've covered what copyright is and the rights associated with it, let's talk about how this all works. There are two major aspects to the legality of copyright. There's the legislation, and then there's contracts or licenses. So first, we're going to talk about the legislative side of things. So the Copyright Act is federal legislation. So it applies across the country, regardless of which province or territory you're teaching in. International students, for example, studying at Fanshawe from abroad would still need to follow copyright laws in Canada. Another example is that regardless of the nationality or the author or where a work was first published, the Copyright Act is still in play. So a kind of comparison to think about this is you bought, you know, an Italian car, and you imported it, you're really excited about it. You probably want to drive it on Canadian roads. Thus, you would still need to follow Canadian laws. This is the same for copyright law. So there are three main pieces of the legislation. There's the rights for the creators and users, which we talked about. There's the exceptions to these rights, which we'll talk about more later. And then there's remedies or procedures that are in place for if rights are infringed on. This is all detailed within the legislation. But on the other side here, we have contracts and licenses. So this includes service agreements, terms of use, and end user licenses. These types of agreements will often prescribe the duration of time and at what cost a work can be used. Often rights holders will use this to articulate their rights as well as the remedies if they do need to pursue a dispute for infringement. Generally speaking, though, there will be some kind of contract or license in place when a copyright owner provides permission, and this will typically detail the duration, the number of copies, the format for one-off permissions usage. This is all granted through a contract or a license. Oh, Kim wants to be co-host. Oh, Kim's co-host. No, I can't. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Kim. In case anyone jumps in that I miss. Okay, so moving on. So you can probably tell there are a lot of moving pieces when it comes to copyright in Canada. So we first have that Copyright Act, which is the Canada-wide federal statute, but we also have case law. So this is where decisions come from the courts. So typically, two parties are contesting how they interpreted the Copyright Act. Someone's claiming that someone infringed someone's rights. This decision goes to the courts, but the outcome of that decision then kind of informs the law, or it's seen as interpretation of the law. So there are a number of Supreme Court decisions that inform how copyright works, how we work with it, and we use these decisions to work within the law. So our fair dealing guidelines, for example, came out of 2004 and 2012 case law decisions. We are making use of fair dealing guidelines at Fanshawe, or as a majority of colleges and universities in Canada. These guidelines were developed based on those case law decisions, which are based on an interpretation of the Copyright Act. So there's nothing really about fair dealing in the Copyright Act, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So the final piece here to consider when we're talking about reusing content is license agreements. So you may be granted certain rights or certain exceptions once you sign a license agreement. Library e-resources, for example, are licenses that have been signed by the library to give access to articles and databases to faculty, staff, and students. So there are agreements in place to access that content. So now we all have a general understanding of copyright law, how this works in Canada, but how does this fit in with Open Education Week? So in order to take advantage of open educational resources, or OERs, to their fullest, it's important to have an understanding that they do still have copyright implications. It's just that these copyright implications are more open than traditionally commercially published resources. So creators of OERs do still retain the copyright to their work. They just have licensed and assigned a license that is more open into how other people can use that work. So when thinking about open licenses, the first type of license that will come to mind are Creative Commons licenses generally. So a CC license gives everyone a standardized way to grant the public permission to use their work under copyright law. There are 6 different types of CC licenses, which are made up of a combination of 4 different symbols to represent different aspects of reuse. So first here we have the by symbol. This is the attribution mark. All CC licenses have this because, as I mentioned earlier, attribution is a moral right and cannot be waived. Hence, you always give credit to the creator. The backward C that you see here stands for share alike. So this means if you use a work that has the symbol as part of its license, you need to also make that reuse. If you do modify it, the license you would use would need to have that reuse applied as well, hence share alike. So whatever you're taking, you need to share in the same manner. The $ with the slash through it just stands for non-commercial. This means that only non-commercial uses of the work are permitted. So you cannot be making a profit or engage in any commercial interaction with that type of license. The final symbol here is the equal sign. So this stands for no derivatives or adaptations of the work that are permitted. So no changes can be made in any way. That's what to know when you see that equal sign as part of the license. So it's kind of important to know the different combinations of these licenses that are made up through the 6 different options, because OERs typically do have a CC license assigned to them. And if you are creating your own OER, you'll want to think about how these different options decide what works best for you and how you envision your work being used by others in the future. So I just got a quick question about the backward C. Yes, so the backward C stands for share alike. So that means that if you use, so we've got 2 here that have share alike as part of it. So that would mean if you adopted that OER, you don't really have to worry about anything if you're just using it. But if you wanted to then modify it, because both of those, notice they don't have the no derivative, so that means that you can change it. It just means that when you change it, you need to make that reuse available under the same type of license. I think hopefully that's a little bit more clear. So it just means that when you are once you edit it, your OER, you've made it available, you would need to apply the same type of license and make it available to others that would then want to be able to modify it and share it as well. We have another question here from Tara. So does educational use fall under commercial use? So it does and it doesn't, it depends. So something to keep in mind, if we're looking for permissions for content, as long as it's within FOL, it's directly for your students, that's not commercial. If we're talking about making a promotional video for the college, because that is commercial, it would profit the college to make that video. Example, so selling something for cost in the bookstore, that is also commercial. Even though we aren't making a profit, it's still a commercial interaction. So those are just 2 things to keep in mind. I'm using for teaching purpose. Same question. Since College Universe makes money, can we not use OER with? So yes, so as long as it's like, you have to really think about the specific use of the resource. So if you're using it in your classroom and it's for the students directly, that is not commercial. But if we were engaging in a commercial exchange, so again, selling a course back in a bookstore, or making a promotional video to attract new students, those are commercial interactions. All right, so let's move on here. Okay, so now we have a general understanding of how copyright and open work together, but it's important to mention the zero textbook movement as well. Zero textbook is a term that is used to describe a course that does not require students to purchase any textbooks or reading materials. This means that the content in the course is free for enrolled students, but not necessarily to anyone else. And this content typically does not have as many options for adaptability or modification as an OER would. So actually, all OERs are in fact zero textbook because it would be free for the students in the class, but not all zero textbook options are OERs. So we're going to work through what this would look like in practice. So there are a number of options available if you wanted to work towards creating a zero textbook course. Here I've lumped these options into 4 broad categories. So the first one is library resources. This is anything that you gained access to through the library. So again, those are paid subscriptions, but the access is free to college staff, faculty, and students. So it would be considered a zero textbook option. The second one is publicly available online content. So this would be content you found online that is legitimate. You can use this in your course, and by providing this to students, again, it is a free option for students reading material wise. Then we have fair dealing. So this is that exception in the Copyright Act that I keep alluding to that we will talk about soon, I promise. But it's important to keep in mind that fair dealing assessments are always done on a case-by-case basis, but we'll go through that in more detail. And then the final one here, the backup option is licensed content. So this would be content in which we went through the process, we got that license, permission was granted, usually a fee, but not always. Some independent authors like their work being used in educational courses and will waive the fee and grant permission for reuse, as long as they know it's for the students. So that's just something to keep in mind as well, because the reason this is still zero textbook is from the student's perspective, they're not paying for that licensed content. Licensed content is covered by the copyright budget or sometimes schools directly. So yes, it's being paid for, but it's being paid for by the college and being provided to students for free. So it still is a zero textbook option for them. But let's take some more look at these 4 options in a bit more depth. So the good news is, if you're hoping to use library resources as a way to move your course closer to being zero textbook, we have a lot of options available here. The library subscribes to over 50,000 e-journals with tens of thousands of academic articles available through those, over 258,000 ebooks, 5,000 physical books, 20 different streaming platforms containing more than 87,000 videos. Plus, we have access to all other library collections through interlibrary loan. So this is a great place to start, and I would argue this should be your first stop when looking for resources to use in your courses. In addition to library subscription-based resources, our librarians can also work with you directly to find and assess or even assist with the creation of your own OERs. So this really is kind of your one-stop shop for support in getting resources. But let's assume the resource you're hoping to use isn't available through the library. You've already talked to your school's librarian about adding this resource to the collection. It's just not feasible. So then we would turn to one of those other 4 broad categories, one of which is fair dealing. I think the library will be happy to have phones reading, although most of us aren't in the library physically right now, but we could definitely be reached. So this is great. I'm excited that people are learning more. No, okay. So fair dealing is an exception within the Copyright Act that allows for work to be copied as long as it's for one of the listed purposes and the copied work is determined to be fair. So our fair dealing guidelines come out of both the Copyright Act and case law. Section 29 of the Act is where we get this list of purposes that allows for fair dealing. As you can see in the chart, education was added to this list in 2012. Although it could be argued that the work taking place at the college also falls in line with research and private study as well. Either way, the copying you would want to do for your courses would likely fit into one of these purposes. And this is all that is said in the Copyright Act about fair dealing. So just keep that in mind. So we have those 8 purposes that allow those would allow for copying without permission. Notice that education, though, is an undefined term. So this is a kind of a broad umbrella with which to work. There have been a lot of challenges associated with all of these broad terms. So to an extent, they can be applied in an unrestricted manner. However, on the right side here is where we have the interpretations that have come out of case law decisions, specifically a case in 2004, which gives us these 6 factors on which to decide if the use is deemed to be fair. So first, we have the purpose. So are we using it for one of those purposes in the Act? Yes, education, check, perfect, that one's good. The next one is character of use. So how many of those economic rights that I went through at the beginning of the session would we be taking advantage of by reproducing that work? So that's important to keep in mind. That's the character of the use. The amount of work is also important when determining if it's fair. So people talk a lot about the 10% rule when it comes to fair dealing, but take this with a grain of salt. It is important to consider how much of the work is being copied from both a qualitative and quantitative perspective, and 10% exactly may not take this into account. And there is no mention of 10% in the Copyright Act or in any case law decisions. Then we have availability of alternatives. So a link is a great alternative. This means that a copy doesn't have to be managed. And something to keep in mind. Then we have the nature of the work. So an example here would be textbooks that are adopted and considered required. It's expected that students will purchase the book. So then there's a bit of a contract at play. When the bookstore makes it available, it's assumed they're going to sell a certain amount. So we could get into a competition law issue because copying could infringe on some of those economic rights that we mentioned earlier by the publisher. Then we have the effect of the use. So this is the final one here. So again, an easy way to think about this would be if copying might have a negative impact on sales of the required textbook. So that would be a negative effect. But if the textbook wasn't required, there's no loss in sales, this would be considered fair. All right, so here we have a simplified way to think about fair dealing and what really is a short excerpt. Like I said, assessments should always be done on a case-by-case basis to really determine if the copying is indeed fair. The best thing about it is you don't have to do this alone. I am here to help and make these assessments for you. Either way, though, you still need to recognize the source with an attribution statement. So this would include the title of the work, the author, and where you retrieved it. It's also important to remember that these guidelines only last for the duration of a course, because if the course isn't active, then we can't make the claim that the copy is for educational purposes. So if you need to use more than what's allowed in accordance with the college's fair dealing guidelines, then we would look to those other options. So publicly available content or licensed content. So let's first take a moment to talk about like why we can use publicly available content. Because believe it or not, it's not just because it's on the internet. So the most recent amendment to the Copyright Act was in 2012. So this is when section 30.04 was added, which covers work available through the internet. This amendment was new and revolutionary at the time. No other country actually still has an exemption like this, and it has not yet been challenged in Canadian courts. So we are lucky that we do have this option to take advantage of in Canada. So how can we make use of this exception? So if you come across content that's publicly available online, where you don't have to subscribe or register, so there's no digital barrier there, then you can reproduce it. You can communicate it, but that attribution right always still applies. So if we're thinking about what is publicly available content, it's still important to keep in mind whether or not the work was made available with or without the consent of the copyright owner. Especially in the era of mis and disinformation, we really want to ensure content is legitimate and comes from a legitimate source. But once you have determined the source is indeed legitimate, you can use this content in your course. You can even change the format or copy the work to make it available through FOL, so as a PDF or a Word document, as long as you cite it, and that citation is on the copy. Oh wow, just jumping ahead. Okay. So when searching for online content, though, be sure to watch for those digital locks. Don't copy and paste or go into coding to circumvent digital locks. You'll also want to keep an eye out for any visible notice that prohibit reuse. Also ensure that the content is actually available in Canada. If it's not available in our country, then we would need to get permission or a license for Canadian use. So yes, Tara, a paywall would be included. So even as a member, and we have access to, say I have a subscription to New York Times, I would have access to that, but I have no right to share that access with other people. So we would need to seek permission for the New York Times. Luckily, we have most New York Times through the library. But yes, a lot of member associations sometimes will, I've worked with a few faculty where we seek permission and the permission is granted at no cost. But then sometimes that's not the case. But that would be a situation where we would need to seek permission to reuse the content. So we've gone through all of our options here, but what does this really look like in practice? So whether you're using library resources, content that was reproduced in accordance with fair dealing, publicly available content, or even if it is licensed content, we have a few options for how to make this content available to students. So we'll just walk through these three here. So the first one is scan and upload. So as long as we've gotten permission to reuse, so this is a physical material. So say there's a book in the library's collection or in your personal collection, you own that physical book. Either we're making it available through fair dealing or we've sought permission and we've gotten that license. When we do get permissions from publishers, they will not provide us with a digital copy. So keep that in mind. We do have to make our own digital copy. We're just paying for the right to reproduce that. But as long as we've gotten that permission or it's in fair dealing, that copyright disclaimer has been added to the copy. This can be added to FOL, but it does still need to be managed because that permission and fair dealing, all of those assessments are based on that course being active. So it would need to be removed from your FOL course site before the end of term. But I send out reminders. You don't really have to worry about that. So the second option here is copy, paste, and upload. So this is referring to content that is publicly available online. So this content needs to adhere to those terms listed in section 30.04 of the Copyright Act. You will still need to cite the source. And again, the content would need to be removed from FOL at the end of the term. And finally, the third option, the much easier option, is the hyperlink. So here you do not need to acknowledge the source, just confirm the link itself is not broken, pop it into FOL. This does not need to be managed and can be left up in your course site even after the term ends. So if you do want to go this linking route, it's important to first recognize the reason we can't actually link to content and it not be considered copyright infringement that we're linking to it is due to a 2011 court case. It was decided that a link or hyperlink should never be seen as publication of content to which it refers. So this is actually what allows us to use links and hyperlinks in handouts, slides, or within FOL. This also includes linking to videos or embedding videos directly into FOL, as when you embed a video, the player just pulls the content directly from the source. So that's all good. If that source disappeared, your link would then be broken. So if you are wanting to link to materials you found through the library's collection, though, you'll need to make sure that you use either a permalink or a DOI, as the URL at the top of your browser is actually unique to your login and search results. So I didn't actually screenshot the browser up here, but the URL at the top of the page, your regular URL, that link will not work for students. They get very confused. It tries to log them into EBSCO or ProQuest. So if you send that permalink, it'll prompt students to log into their FOL credentials and then pop them directly to the catalog resource that you're pointing to. So if you're looking for assistance with copyright clearance, this is why I'm here to help. So we're requesting materials for assessment, whether the copy could be reproduced in accordance with fair dealing or if it'll need to be licensed. Doesn't really matter. I will let you know either way how it works out. But what I'll need you to send me is a list of readings. So the digital copies of the readings, again, those will not be provided by the publisher. We'll also need the course code in the title of the course, as well as the maximum student enrollment number, or as close to accurate as possible. We don't want to pay for more students than are enrolled in the course, but we also don't want to have less permissions and have too many students in the course. So we need to know this because the permission fees are determined based on use and access points. So the amount of students in the course and the access points affects the cost of the permission. So once you've sent over these materials, I will then screen for copyright compliance. I'll obtain those permissions if needed, and I'll even add the source acknowledgement and copyright disclaimer directly to the copy for you. So super easy process. And once we've done this, you can now upload the content directly to FOL for students to access, and you can rest assured that your course is indeed copyright compliant, or at least the reading materials are. But what about those slide decks? So I think it's probably safe to assume that everyone is incorporating images into their lecture slides, even if minimal. So how can we use images and be sure that the slide decks are still copyright compliant? So if you found these images online, it is likely that they are considered publicly available online content. However, the images must be from a legitimate online source. They can't be protected by digital locks or watermarks, or have a clearly visible notice prohibiting copying the image, even if it is for educational use. In fact, some watermarks are traceable, therefore takedown notices could be issued by the copyright owner. So just something to keep in mind when you're doing those searches. But once you've found an image, you've confirmed that it's from a legitimate source, it's still always important to ensure that you acknowledge that source. At the very least, make sure you have the name of the website and the URL that you retrieved the image from. To be an accurate attribution statement, the link must lead the reader directly to the web page that you retrieved the image from. If someone's like, oh man, I love this image, I want to go see this image, link takes them, image is there, perfect. Publicly available online content, we're good to go. So a quick note on Google image searches. So when performing an image search, it's important that when citing it, that you do use the correct URL and website. So you want to make sure it's from a legitimate source, that you view the original content. So you want to go over here, go to the image, because again, you need that link that will direct the person to the image and where the image lives, the source of the image. Whereas this URL at the top is just your search results, so that won't lead the people that really want to see that image to the image. You can make this a little bit easier for yourself by starting with an advanced image search option. Google actually has a drop-down for usage rights. I know this is a really long form, but you don't need to use the whole form. You can do your regular terms, I don't know, cat with a clock. Say you want to find an image of a cat with a clock. You can put those in your regular search terms. And then the usage rights, there are 3 options. So there's Creative Commons licenses, commercial or other, and then all. So if you drop that usage rights down to Creative Commons licenses, you can know that all of the images coming up in your search results have a CC license associated with them. An easier way to do this is you can go directly to the CC image site and just search within there, and then you'll know how you can use that image. Yeah, one more thing. So the last piece of content we're going to cover is videos. I have listed YouTube here, but the same would apply for Vimeo, etc. Things you're going to want to keep an eye out for are who uploaded the video, how long has it been there, is there information accompanying the video that lends legitimacy to the contact, is it the World Health Organization? Does it say that does it link to them? That's a good way to know that it's the TED Talks, they have their own playlists. You can rest assured that those are TED Talks. If it's a full episode of a TV show, maybe make sure the production company of that TV show posted it and not like, Fred 109 or something. So you'll notice in the top example that the production company or owner of the content is visibly listed, whereas the bottom video likely posted by an individual that does not own the copyright to this content that they're sharing. Note that it even says no copyright infringement intended. Believe it or not, simply stating this does not save you from violating copyright. It's actually probably a pretty clear rule that you are, in fact, violating copyright. So once you're sure that the video is legitimate, was posted by the rights owner, you can provide a link or embed it directly into FOL. One more thing to note with YouTube is if you're using it to share your recorded lectures with students, and please ensure that you set it up on a private channel and provide that link through FOL, because all of the exceptions in the Copyright Act and everything we've talked about today only works if we're doing it for educational use. And by having it public, that would mean that people that aren't students enrolled in your course would have access to that information. And so all of the kind of exceptions that we've taken advantage of would no longer apply. So just briefly, before we move on to questions, I wanted to highlight the supports available to you through the Copyright Office, also known as me. So the first 2 lines here, digital permissions and open licenses, copyright clearances and fair dealing assessments, all of that can be done by sending me an email or setting up a one-on-one copyright consultation, which is just really a fancy word for hopping on the phone or Zoom and talking one-on-one about copyright in a little bit more depth, walking through different options. This we can do in preparation for physical course packs or any courses you're preparing for that you want to make things available digitally through FOL. We can walk through all of these options. The last 2 here, so digital document delivery is a service we set up at the beginning of the pandemic to provide access to the physical collection. The library is now open, so you can go browse those physical books if you want to see them. But if you aren't able to make it to campus, we can scan short excerpts and make those available if it is in accordance with fair dealing. So if you want to do that, email me as well. And then the last one is takedown request. So this is content that is you're the copyright owner. You've noticed your lecture slides, your course packs that you've created are popping up on Course Hero or StuDocu or all those other sharing sites that students use. We can issue takedown requests on your behalf. So send me an email with the link to the content and I will be happy to do that. I can also add your course code or name to our spreadsheet that we do routine checks for every once in a while and just issue takedown requests automatically. All right, so before, again, I turn to questions, I do want to plug the rest of the sessions being offered this week for open education. Tomorrow we have the e-learning open house, which is from 4 to 6 p.m. So this you can just drop in at any time with a question. You'll be directed to a breakout room. Your question will be answered on the spot. A really good way to get a bunch of questions answered at once. We'll have a lot of different people there. And then on Thursday, the faculty showcase at 10 a.m. This will be a panel of faculty that have adopted OERs and how this has worked for them in the classroom. I'm definitely going to check it out. I think it's going to be awesome. And then on Friday, we have an H5P workshop, which is just, a tool that you can use to make things a little bit more friendly for your students. But before I open the floor to questions, I am going to pose a question to the audience. And the first person to answer correctly in the chat will receive a $25 gift card to the Fanshawe retail store. So I guess get your fingers ready for typing. I don't have this written, so I will do my best to read it slowly. So name one of the 4 bundled options mentioned in today's presentation that you can utilize to move your course closer to being a 0 textbook course. The first one to answer will be our winner. That is correct. Amy Taylor, you are the winner. Library resources. And now, very exciting. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and, oh, no, I didn't stop sharing the screen. And we're going to open the floor to questions. So feel free to unmute yourself and just ask a question. Or pop it in the chat. No questions, the wrong question. I don't know about doing software demo videos. So you mean like you want to demo software for your students? Okay. So that would be, it would, again, I mean, you can send me an email more specifically. It depends on the software. If it's software that we have licensed at the college, so say Adobe, because we have Adobe licenses for everyone, this is okay because we paid the license and that gives us the right to demo that software to students. And again, this is kind of key to making sure that you're doing this in a protected fashion so that the demo is only accessible to students and not the public. There isn't, I don't think, a sample form for students to sign, but we definitely can. If you want to send me an email, we can put together just some things so that you have that on record that they did say it was okay to use. But you can actually get permission to use rights orally. Obviously, we prefer to have rights assigned in a written manner, but this is not required. You can grant permission orally for copyright reuse. Awesome. Yeah, happy to meet for course preparation for sure. Sure, sounds good. Yep, send me an email with these questions. So images from publisher slides, if it is a required textbook, so you've adopted the textbook, which is the only way you would get access to the supplementary materials, those slide decks cannot be altered in any way. So you would not be able to pull the images out of a slide deck and pop it into a Fanshawe branded slide without asking permission. Publishers are quite restrictive on how you can use those resources. So you can add your own content to beef them up, but you cannot pull anything out. That would include copying and pasting it and putting it in a fan shell branded slide. That is not allowed with publisher slide decks, unfortunately. But we can always seek permission from the publisher. And if you've adopted the textbook, they'll probably give the go ahead, but it is something we still need to get permission for. Okay. Well, if we don't have any other questions, thanks everyone for coming to listen to me chat about copyright for an hour on your Tuesday morning. And I hope that you all get a chance to enjoy what looks like going to be a really sunny day, hopefully a lunchtime walk. Yeah, that's all I have to say. If you have copyright questions, I'm only an email away. Doesn't have to just be today. Awesome. I'm glad everyone found it informative. Hey, have a great day, everyone.